Welcome to another episode of No Notes, where the conversation is always a perfect 10 out of 10. This podcast is powered by Elios Health, the most used and most loved AI platform in behavioral health, equipping more than 120 organizations and over 10,000 providers with powerful automation tools that streamline documentation, simplify compliance, and surface deep care insights that drive better client outcomes. I'm your host, Dr. Denny Morrison, and for today's episode, we are excited to be joined by Jeremy Attermann, MSW, Senior Director of Strategy and Ventures at the National Council for Mental Wellbeing. We'll discuss a little bit about the hopes and fears stirred by AI in behavioral health as we navigate this new and exciting frontier. So welcome, Jeremy, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Denny.
Before we get into the topic that we want to discuss, tell us a little bit about your background and what you do at National Council for Mental Wellbeing.
Sure thing. So my background is in the mental health clinical delivery space. I worked as a case manager and then a clinician for a number of years in Los Angeles before coming to the National Council, where I've worn many hats over my about 8 years tenure. The National Council is a national association representing about 3,400 mental health and substance use providers across the country. We advocate and support our members to deliver high quality behavioral health services to all people. And we do that by building a strong network of partners and allies that contribute to the behavioral health system.
And so how long have you been doing this, and when did you get out of direct care provision?
Yeah, so it's probably, I made the move from Los Angeles to DC, so about 8 years ago. The National Council, we're so focused on behavioral health provider organizations and the staff therein. And so it's such a value when we can bring our own experiences, quote, in the field to the work we're trying to do, to the ways that we're trying to improve the behavioral health system for all people.
Yeah, I think that is really important. I know we have, having worked at Random Mental Health Center, and we had a lot of issues with state government employees who had no experience whatsoever in behavioral health care, but they were tasked with managing the behavioral health system in the states. I think that having that lived experience, and as a provider or as a peer, in National Council is really helpful. So today what we want to talk about is kind of aspirationally, where are we with AI these days? What's possible for the future? Before we get into kind of like the futuristic thinking, which is I'm really excited to hear about, how do you see the current role of AI in behavioral health care? Where's it stand these days?
Yeah, it's interesting to see the current state of AI and behavioral health, given that it is still such a new technology for the common folk, as I'll call myself. And I think a lot of the folks in the behavioral health field, it really wasn't until your ChatGPT exploded onto the scene that folks understood what folks like you, Denny, and others have been sort of working on for decades, really. And I say that because it's pretty phenomenal to see how quickly the behavioral health field has adopted a mindset around AI in a way that I think I wouldn't have expected. And maybe there's other major events like the pandemic and the shift to virtual delivery that has sort of helped that along. But for a field that, for better or worse, has been deemed as non-innovative and non-technologically savvy, behavioral health has, I think, done a good job as a field and as a system of trying to embrace what is coming in AI. And I think that has started with some of the, what I will call, safer spaces. And I say that for lack of a better term. I don't think that one is necessarily safer than the other, but maybe, again, I'll speak to that common folk piece again. There are some technologies, AI technologies, that feel safer to use as a behavioral health professional. And I think that's where the industry is sort of starting to find itself. When we think about technologies to support the administrative burden of documentation, of clinical documentation, that is a safer space than some of the other use cases that have come out or will come out around AI. And so I think that there is a good consensus that AI is certainly here to stay across industries and across sectors, but even within behavioral health, and that it's not all doom and gloom, that it's not all we're out of a job, that there is a lot of benefit for the organization, the professionals, and of course, the clients being served.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more about how quickly it's been adopted. And I agree with your kind of the assessment, right or wrong. I think behavioral health tech as an industry has been viewed as kind of hard to change. They don't, adapt easily to new things, which to me is always paradoxical because we're in the change management business. But that's a whole other conversation, I guess. But it is fascinating to me because I've been helping out Helios now for about 5-6 years now, and the speed with which it's become adopted and how quickly providers who use the technology, like you said, for improved documentation, and I think that is safer. I think that's a fair term. That AI is not making clinical judgments or making, in-depth clinical recommendations. They're making information out available to the clinician, help them document faster, better, easier. But they adopt it quickly. The clinicians do, and I think they see the value prop behind it. So I agree with you. I think the adoption rate has been pretty astounding, frankly, much faster, certainly than the speed with which EHRs were accepted.
Technology around documentation support feels like one of the most prominent technologies that is really sort of fully designed to support the provider. I think the other technologies that we find in behavioral health space, while vitally important, electronic health records is one example, while vitally important for the overall delivery and outcomes of care, when you think about the impact on the provider, I wouldn't necessarily say the EHR is designed to make the life of the provider easier. I'm not trying to say it's going to make it harder, but it's just not designed just solely with that provider in mind necessarily. But I think you have these other technologies that are really trying to get at those so specifically, and I think that also helps with some of the receptivity.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I to be honest with you, I do think they did make the clinician's life harder, and not intentionally, of course, but I think a good old friend of mine used to say, there is nothing faster than scribbling a note. It's like, when you go from writing something very quickly and being done, anything beyond that is harder. And I do think the AI documentation products that we see like Helios really are targeting the clinician as the primary beneficiary. They're the ones who benefit. And I think the clients that they see benefit. And I'm not sure how you feel about that, though. I mean, I think clearly it does benefit the clinician, but do you see clients benefiting from this?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that recently about, AI, the impact on the other folks outside of the provider space. I think we're talking about clinical documentation. I think the impact to the client is not as direct. I think you could look at the time saved by the provider, the reduction in administrative burden, and how that impacts the provider wellness, and what that means then for the delivery of care and the quality of that therapeutic relationship. That's a little more indirect. I think more directly, this gets into other spaces we were sort of alluding to around sort of clinical decision support, but even just having quality documentation from session to session makes a big difference as a clinician. And again, you talked about scribbling notes. I was a case manager and a clinician, scribbling notes and decoding my scribbled notes and trying to understand what I did last time to this time. And I think if there is technology that can support some of that space and allow providers to feel more confident that they understand what we're doing and where we have been and where we're going, that's going to also help the client as well. I think there's a lot on the organization side too around staff well-being, around efficiencies in care, or around efficiencies in service delivery. That has an impact. So I think that there is sort of a rippling effect of, if you start with the provider, but there's an impact both on the organization, especially on the client.
Yeah. The other thing too, I think, is that if a clinician doesn't have to worry about, say, if they're trying to do collaborative documentation and doing this, so Jeremy, how'd you feel about that kind of thing? While they're typing, they can be more present for that client. And, Helios has got some research, it's preliminary, but it was a randomized control trial where clients stayed engaged in treatment longer with clinicians who used Helios. And I really do believe that has something to do with the clinician able to focus on the task of therapy rather than, oh, I got to make sure I write this down, or don't forget this because I got another patient in 10 minutes and I won't have time to document it and all that kind of stuff. And all that kind of clears the deck, and they can still be present with the client. So, hey, tell me about this. I understand, you guys did a survey recently and you got some interesting data from National Council members.
So the National Council recently completed a 5-part webinar series looking at AI and behavioral health. So we covered topics from like your 101 type of content around AI, all the way to our last webinar was around some of the risk and legal liability questions that come up when using this technology. And so when we had asked webinar attendees, during registration, we asked them a few of these questions. And so pretty interesting results that I'd love to share. The first question we asked, are you familiar with the basic concepts of AI as they apply to behavioral health? You had 15% say not familiar at all. I think that's probably a good number. You had 40% that said slightly familiar, and you had 34% that said moderately familiar. So that was the bulk, either not familiar at all, or really was either slightly or moderately familiar. And so what that tells me is that folks are listening, they're reading up about this, they're trying to keep up with it. The next question was, to what extent do you agree with the statement, AI technologies will enhance the quality of care provided in behavioral health settings? And here we saw also a really interesting trend. Very, very few. So in total, less than 3% said strongly disagree or disagree. So that would mean that I do not think at all that AI technologies will enhance the quality of behavioral health care. You had 47% that said neutral. And that's, so almost half of our webinar attendees are kind of not sure. You had 39% that agreed and then 11% that strongly agreed. So that's about your other 50% or so that's saying this is going to have a positive impact. So the fact that half are neutral and half are towards positive, I see that as a great trend. The last question we asked, has your organization currently adopted or integrated any AI technologies into your organization's daily activities? I'll note here that we did not define what is AI technology. We asked just yes, no, not sure. So 14% of respondents said, yes, we are currently using an AI technology or in the process of adopting it. 27% said not sure, which was interesting. And then 59% no. So a lot of green space for use here among behavioral health providers. And those who said yes, I just want to double click there for a second. The 14% that said yes, not everyone responded with which technology they were using, but for those who did, I'd say about half listed a non-compliant or a non-use case technology in behavioral health. And what I mean by that is I'm using ChatGPT for my AI technology. And again, we did not ask in what way are you using it, but we, again, anecdotally know and expect that there may be some providers that are using these, again, non-HIPAA compliant, these non-specified for use cases for things like clinical documentation.
Anecdotally, I've heard the same thing that you were talking about, Jeremy, that some clinicians are using ChatGPT or something like it to write a progress note. And that's really not best practice by any means. So, ChatGPT, it does have its place, but it's not purpose built for clinical applications like all of the ones actually that are in this space, Elio's included, but all the vendors in this space use purpose built large language models that are specific to the behavioral health industry. So I agree with your interpretation of those data. There's lots of opportunity here, and they're not outright rejecting it. There's general acceptance of this idea of this, and many are using it already. So, kind of from your perspective, when you look at AI, what about this excites you?
So a few areas that I'm really excited about. One in particular that's a little more here and now. I think Elios is doing a lot of work in this space, is around the clinical decision support. The amount of information in healthcare broadly, not specifically behavioral health, but healthcare broadly, has become so robust that the amount of information that a single healthcare provider would need to know, especially maybe a physician, so much of it becomes obsolete so quickly, and there's just too much knowledge of it. And I think in behavioral health, while there is perhaps not the full large textbook of what a physician needs to know around all the medical pieces, what I think about is how much information is being shared explicitly or implicitly when we are providing care in behavioral health, and how, as providers, we may or may not catch all of it. I think that, through measurement informed care and the use of regular assessments, we gain a lot of foothold to have objective data and insight into what is happening. But even then, I think people are just not great at catching trends or things that are said. And so I'm really excited and sort of optimistic about this clinical decision support space of how we can leverage the technologies to offer the provider insight into things that they may or may not be noticing. And there's just so much use case in that regard. Again, this is ways to empower the provider. This is ways to improve the quality of care, ways to improve what care is being provided, and making decisions about care pathways and the treatment types. So that has me really excited about what direction we may go in that regard. The other area I'm really excited about, I think it's a little too early days still, is what I think about the use of technology, of AI technology, to offer providers a safe space to practice their delivery of care using, simulations and things like that. I reflect back, I'm very proud of the school I went to for my master's in social work. Shout out to UCLA. Great program. There are a lot of great programs out there as well. But it's really hard to mimic the space of delivering behavioral health services, especially when you're talking about everything from outpatient to sort of one-on-one to crisis situations. And, no amount of vignettes, no amount of, your classmate pretending to be somebody with, whatever, sort of prepares you for those situations. And I don't think AI simulations fully do either, but they are a much bigger step forward for providers to practice how to respond to situations. And so I'm really excited about the opportunities for this AI simulation training to help providers of all types in behavioral health, peer providers, case managers, community health workers, clinicians, et cetera, sort of hone their ability to deliver quality care. So those are the two areas I'm very excited about, and again, optimistic about for the future of behavioral health.
Yeah, I think I'd love this idea. I hadn't really thought much about this idea of simulation and the use of AI in simulation training and using it as a way to help clinicians get better at their task while they're in training. That's a very exciting idea, I think. So these are really upsides, opportunities, exciting things. What are your worries about AI in this industry?
I think much of this probably comes down to, as with all of the risks we see or sort of concerns we see perhaps in the delivery of care is like patient safety, is client safety. And so just going for a second, I have sort of examples here, right? So if we think about that clinical decision support example I just said that I'm so excited about, at the same time, what happens if the technology is making a recommendation that ends up being non-productive, say, towards the person's outcomes? And of course, we could be talking extreme situations too. It probably rare, but extreme situations. That's where patient safety has to come in. Of course, none of these technologies replace provider and provider decisions, right? They are informing, they are supporting the provider in making the decisions. They are not replacing. But it still, has some concern when we think about the underlying technology and to throw out my 3 buzzwords I know around AI, the large language models used to build the technologies. What data is being used to build those? Is the data, diverse and representative of the folks being served? Are we looking at the data and the large language model to catch these bugs that you hear about from time to time that happen within AI, these, I think, big hallucinations or, that come out in the technologies, are we doing a good job looking for those things? Because at the end of the day, when a technology is even informing or supporting a decision that could lead to, again, everything from mild to catastrophic impact on a client, well, now we have to really think about client safety and client protection here. So that's I think the area that downside, we'll call it downside. The other one I think is around providers as well. These technologies will hopefully make the delivery of care more effective, but also more efficient. I think from a timely perspective, even just very simply, if you look at the reduction of time, Elios has looked at this quite a bit. I love their data on it. The amount of time saved by a clinician or a provider when you can use AI technology to do your clinical documentation. That's wonderful. And if it saves hours in a given week for a provider, that's great for their mental well-being of the provider. It should not be replaced then by, well, now you can take on additional clients, right? So great, we've freed up 4 hours. That means 2 more clients that can be served. And we know there's a big wait list and there's a want. There might be a knee-jerk reaction to say, great, now you have more time. Let's get you a bigger caseload. I think that's the other area I would just sort of be mindful of as we see efficiencies in how we do work. And we're just focused on the clinical side of this, Denny. I think there's a lot on the sort of operational financial side we could talk about too within behavioral health organizations. But just on the clinical side, efficiencies in care that should not equal more output. So those are some things that come to mind for me if I think about the sort of quote downside.
Yeah, one area we haven't even talked about, but when you're comment about the wait list issue, which still does occur, and I think we are the Elios-like technologies, the decision support technologies and documentation do help chip away at that. But the other big domain that is attempting to address that, which really came up through COVID, is the use of apps. A cognitive behavioral therapy app or a mindfulness app. There are 10 to 20,000 of these things on the App Store, and only 3 to 4% of them have any data behind them. But they're, and they are client-facing tools, where the Elios tools are clinician-facing. So, what have you given much thought to those kind of technologies that really are not clinician-supporting technology? They are direct-to-consumer kind of things?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will sort of say, first, from the National Council perspective, maybe at a small glance, we're sort of keeping an eye on those things. We, representing behavioral health organizations and the employees there, are really focused on the providers first and foremost, but the organizations and the staff employed, and then of course the people they serve. The sort of direct to consumer space is one that I personally am very worried about because of just the rampant explosion. Even before, as you said, sort of like during the pandemic, there was a lot coming out there. And I can assume good intent for most actors. I'm not going to do it for all actors. I'll say for most actors, perhaps the delivery of these, the production and delivery of these apps and whatnot are done with best intent, trying to get at better access to care, trying to get at folks who prefer to engage in, quote, services in a different way. Not everyone wants to see a clinician or a peer. Not everyone wants to have the outpatient service. There's a lot I like about consumer client or patient choice. But there, like you said, there's little safeguards, there's little oversight around these things to date. I know that there are states that are trying to stand up more regulation here. Shout out to the state of Utah, who has stood up the, I think, first office of AI. That office is looking across industries and sectors, but their first foray was into mental health. And they looked at it mostly from both consumer protection of mental health, of AI technologies around mental health. And they were looking a lot about these direct to consumer products. But I will also say out loud that their other sort of mandate is to support and not diminish innovation in AI technologies. There's a want to not knee-jerk over-regulate this space, I think. And so in the meantime, it's a lot of education, both for, of course, National Council audiences, but also just the general audience about, how do you make the right decision about what tool or resource you want to engage in. these I'll call them treatment adjunctive or supplemental or sort of alternatives to what would be maybe traditional treatment. Again, on its surface, I think it could be welcome to have for folks who want those and who those work more effectively for, or they have a preference for. But again, until we have sort of better oversight that can ensure safety in a bit, safety and outcomes, right? I think that's the other piece here too, is a lot of these may or may not actually sort of move someone towards a more positive recovery oriented space. And if they're not, but that's where they're investing all of their time and effort and energy, then that's concerning as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. I have similar concerns, but want to remain optimistic about that as a potential alternative. Because and I could see on one hand that some of these are kind of like the equivalent of, that you can now do birth control tests at home as opposed to going to the doctor. You can do diabetic testing at home, and there are things that fully just consumer facing, let you do it yourself kind of thing. I think there's a space for that. The data is not encouraging about their uptake and compliance, that people don't stick with them. I do think that the bigger problem with these things has been that they've been pitched as alternative to therapy rather than an adjunct to therapy, and something that would integrate with an EHR so that a clinician could say, I'll see you, Jeremy, today, and then I'll see you again in 2 weeks. And in the meantime, I want you to do these things on the app, and that data will flow back and I can kind of monitor and see what you're doing. And that to me, that's kind of like a best case scenario for where we have a little bit of both, a little bit of client facing and total. We're not seeing a lot of that integration stuff. They just don't go that direction.
Yeah, and look, I'm sure it's technologically challenging, but there are a lot of companies that I personally met with who, again, best intent is there. I often do encourage, how are you thinking about that integration? Most of these companies do have safeguards in place, and I don't want to diminish those, minimize those. They have safeguards in place for when somebody is engaging with the app and expresses like harm to self or others, and there is a like response that gets triggered, and a whole bunch of things happen, and that's great. I mean, that is the bare minimum. Any company or any app that does not have that in place, that is a huge red flag. But I think there is more beyond that, how we can integrate these things into what I would broadly call the behavioral health system, so that it doesn't feel so siloed, and that somebody could make the decision to engage with, there are some positive apps out there, could engage in that app, could find meaning, and perhaps make development towards whatever recovery looks like for them, or reduction in symptomology. But when they need a different type of care, when they need a more higher level of care, whatever that might look like, how do we create sort of a seamless, fluid referral into that? And where they're not just fully starting over again. Again, they've been engaging with this technology now for some amount of time, and now they're going to engage perhaps with a person, whether virtually or in person. Let's not just throw out all of that, engagement that happened that, may have been helpful to them.
Tell me, and blue sky it for me for a minute. Where do you see kind of like the future of AI technology in behavioral healthcare, or even healthcare at large? But generally, where do you see this going in the big picture?
There are what I'll call short-term, very impactful wins, of course. Again, things that Elios is looking at around helping to reduce some of the burden on providers, on non-provider staff within organizations. I think that that's going to have a big impact on our field. But looking farther down the road, where I think that behavioral health has historically missed the mark on is around using a more objective, data-centric approach to how care is delivered, and delivering the right care, understanding when the right care is or is not being provided, making pivots accordingly. And so I think that we're going to see a big shift towards now leveraging these technologies in that regard, and that the hope would be that we're going to see better outcomes, and that we can really point to AI technologies to say this was a huge turning point for how we were able to get better at delivering quality care. And that is borne out outcomes we see, those outcomes collected by all sorts of stakeholders, including the National Council, and that we'll be able to really look at that. So that's, do I think there's going to be robot therapists? No, I'm not going to go that far. Maybe there will be. I don't know if any of us will be here by then, but if there will be, good luck to them. But no, I think it's the opportunities to leverage the technology to improve how and what care is delivered. That's the sort of, I think, the biggest pie in the sky piece for me that I think is, it's not that far off.
Well, with that, let us wrap this up. Jeremy Attermann, MSW Senior Director of Strategy and Ventures at the National Council for Mental Wellbeing. Thank you so much for being a guest today, Jeremy.
Thanks, Denny. It was a lot of fun.